In 1849, beneath the ruins of ancient Nineveh, archaeologists uncovered thousands of buried clay tablets from one of history's oldest civilizations. Most were ordinary trade records, temple accounts, royal inventories. But one fragment was different. Damaged, poorly preserved, easy to ignore. Until parts of its inscription were examined more closely. Because according to later interpretations, this was not a prayer, not a king's decree, not a myth. It was a warning. A message pressed into clay more than 5,000 years ago by a civilization long erased by time. And what makes that unsettling is the way it reads. Not like poetry, not like symbolism, but like a direct caution. As though whoever wrote it believed someone in the distant future might one day need to understand it. Historians would urge caution. Ancient translations are debated. Fragments are incomplete. Interpretation can quickly become imagination. But even so, one question refuses to disappear. What kind of warning survives longer than the civilization that created it? Tonight, we examine the buried tablet, the ancient world that produced it, and the disturbing possibility that some messages were never meant for their own time, but for ours. Because history has a strange habit of hiding its most unsettling stories beneath ordinary ruins. When the excavations at ancient Nineveh began in the 19th century, few could have imagined the scale of what lay buried beneath the collapsed remains of one of the ancient world's greatest cities. What first appeared to be little more than broken stone, dust, and architectural debris gradually revealed something far more extraordinary. An archive. A silent library from a civilization long gone. Thousands upon thousands of clay tablets. Some cracked in half. Some reduced to fragments. Others still bearing remarkably preserved lines of cuneiform pressed into clay by hands that had turned to dust thousands of years earlier. For archaeologists, discoveries like these were revolutionary. Because ancient Mesopotamia was not merely another forgotten culture. This was one of the birthplaces of recorded civilization. A world where writing emerged. Where kings documented wars. Where priests tracked celestial movements. Where myths, laws, trade, religion, and political power were all preserved in hardened clay. These were not stories passed loosely from generation to generation. They were records. Physical memory. Messages surviving longer than empires. And among such discoveries, most texts were exactly what historians would expect. Administrative lists. Royal inventories. Temple accounting. Tax documentation. Routine bureaucracy from a civilization deeply obsessed with record keeping. But ancient archives are strange places. Because mixed among ordinary records are often texts that feel entirely different. Stories of catastrophic floods. Kings ruling for impossible spans of time. Descriptions of celestial beings. Creation myths. Prophecies. Warnings. The ancient world did not separate practical documentation from cosmic storytelling the way modern societies do. For them, history, religion, power, and mystery often occupied the same intellectual space. That is what makes certain fragments so compelling. Not because every extraordinary interpretation is true, but because ancient texts sometimes refuse to fit neatly into modern categories. And somewhere in that blurred space between history and mythology sits the fragment at the center of this mystery. A damaged tablet. Incomplete. Contested. Difficult to interpret with certainty. Yet fascinating enough to fuel speculation for generations. Because unlike celebratory royal inscriptions or mythological narratives filled with divine drama, certain descriptions attributed to unusual fragments carry a very different tone. Less ceremonial. Less poetic. More urgent. As though the text was not trying to glorify the past, but preserve caution. That difference matters. Because ancient warnings are psychologically different from ancient myths. Myths explain the world. Warnings try to prevent something. And if a civilization chooses to preserve warning language in durable clay, the implication is unsettling. Someone believed the message mattered enough to survive. Now imagine the scene. A Mesopotamian scribe seated in dim light. Wet clay before him. Reed stylus in hand. Every mark deliberate. Every symbol physical. Unlike ink on fragile paper, clay records permanence. You do not casually record a message in clay. Clay is labor. Clay is intention. Clay is preservation. Which raises an uncomfortable possibility. What if certain ancient texts were written precisely because their authors wanted them to outlive their own age? Not as literature. Not as ritual performance. But as memory. That possibility has fueled endless fascination with Mesopotamian discoveries. Because once an ancient text feels less like symbolic storytelling and more like deliberate warning, the imagination immediately begins asking dangerous questions. Warning about what? A natural disaster? A political collapse? Divine punishment? Forbidden knowledge? Human arrogance? Or something stranger? This is where modern interpretation becomes both fascinating and risky. Because damaged fragments create gaps. And gaps invite projection. Historians are rightly cautious about this. A broken line can change meaning entirely. A disputed translation can create myths that spread far beyond the evidence. Yet history repeatedly shows that some of humanity's most powerful stories begin exactly this way. Fragments. Ambiguity. Interpretation. Mystery. And nowhere does that dynamic feel more potent than ancient Mesopotamia. Because this was a civilization obsessed with cosmic order. Flood cycles. Divine judgment. The fragility of kingship. The danger of disobedience. The limits of human power. Warnings would not have been unusual in their worldview. But some warnings endure differently. Not because we know exactly what they meant, but because they feel disturbingly transferable. As though they could apply to any age. That is what makes this story compelling. Not certainty. Uncertainty. Because uncertainty keeps the message alive. And somewhere between archaeology, myth, and interpretation lies the possibility that a message buried beneath Nineveh was not simply about ancient fears, but universal ones. The fear that knowledge can become dangerous. The fear that humanity repeats mistakes. The fear that warnings are only understood after it is too late. And perhaps that is why this fragment continues to haunt modern imagination. Because if ancient civilizations preserved cautionary messages in clay more than 5,000 years ago, the next question becomes unavoidable. What exactly had they seen that made warning the future seem necessary? That is where this mystery becomes far more unsettling, because discovering an ancient tablet is one thing, but believing it contains a warning powerful enough to outlive an entire civilization is something else entirely. And before we go any further, something must be said clearly. Ancient Mesopotamian texts are among the most difficult records in human history to interpret with absolute certainty. They survive in fragments. Languages evolved. Meanings shifted. Context disappeared. Some tablets are incomplete. Others were copied centuries after the original versions were written. Even expert translations can be debated. That caution matters. Because once mystery enters ancient history, imagination tends to run faster than evidence. And yet, even with all that uncertainty, some ancient texts remain profoundly disturbing, not because we know exactly what they meant, but because certain passages feel emotionally recognizable across thousands of years. Warnings about arrogance. Warnings about catastrophe. Warnings about forbidden boundaries. Warnings about knowledge humans were not prepared to carry. The ancient world was full of such fears. Mesopotamian civilization in particular understood itself as fragile. Cities rose and collapsed. Floods destroyed entire populations. Kings were celebrated one generation and forgotten the next. The world did not feel permanent. It felt conditional. That worldview shaped everything they wrote. Which means if a text carried warning language, it would not necessarily be unusual. But what makes this mystery different is not the existence of warning itself. It is the tone. Because certain interpretations suggest language that feels less like mythological symbolism and more like direct caution. Not abstract morality. Not divine storytelling. Direct caution. As though the message was aimed at behavior. Action. Choice. Consequence. That subtle distinction changes everything. Imagine for a moment a damaged fragment in which only parts of the message survive. A phrase about crossing boundaries. A reference to hidden knowledge. A mention of destruction following human action. An unfinished warning whose full context is lost. Now imagine generations of interpreters trying to reconstruct meaning from broken pieces. That is how ancient mysteries are born. Not from certainty, but from fragments that leave just enough room for fear. And fear is extraordinarily powerful, because the human mind fills incomplete warnings with its own anxieties. If the ancient text mentions flood, we imagine apocalypse. If it mentions gods, we imagine judgment. If it mentions knowledge, we imagine forbidden truth. This is why ancient warning narratives remain so effective even today. Because ambiguity allows them to evolve with the fears of each generation. To ancient Mesopotamians, the danger might have been divine disorder. To modern viewers, it becomes lost technology. Suppressed history. Civilizational collapse. The pattern changes. The emotional structure remains. And that emotional structure becomes even more compelling when we examine how Mesopotamian cultures viewed warning itself. They were deeply concerned with signs, omens, predictions, celestial anomalies, unusual events. Nothing happened in isolation. The universe was believed to communicate through patterns. A flood was not just weather. It could be meaning. An eclipse was not simply astronomy. It could be warning. A failed harvest was not economics. It could be consequence. That worldview created civilizations hyper-attuned to cautionary interpretation. Messages mattered. Patterns mattered. Signs mattered. Which means a warning text would fit naturally into that intellectual world. But then comes the disturbing possibility. What if the warning was not about divine anger at all? What if it was about human behavior? That idea changes the emotional gravity of everything. Because divine punishment belongs to mythology. Human warning belongs to history. A civilization warning future generations about their own mistakes feels much closer to us. Much more personal. And perhaps that is why certain interpretations feel so haunting. Because they sound familiar. Warnings about hubris. Warnings about reaching beyond proper limits. Warnings about carrying knowledge without wisdom. These are not ancient fears alone. They are modern fears. Artificial intelligence. Biotechnology. Weapons. Environmental collapse. Civilizational fragility. Suddenly the emotional distance between ancient and modern disappears. And this may explain why stories like this spread so effectively. Because even when evidence remains uncertain, the psychological resonance feels real. Then there is another possibility. Perhaps the warning was not preserved because of what happened, but because of what almost happened. History remembers catastrophes. But cultures also preserve near disasters. Lessons narrowly learned. Boundaries nearly crossed. Warnings passed down precisely so catastrophe never repeats. If so, then the ancient message becomes even more intriguing. Not an obituary. A prevention mechanism. A memory encoded as caution. And the medium matters. Clay. Permanent. Durable. Difficult to erase accidentally. Unlike speech, clay resists time. Which means if a warning was intentionally preserved this way, the preservation itself becomes meaningful. The act of recording becomes part of the warning. Remember this. Do not forget. Do not repeat. That possibility gives ancient texts extraordinary emotional power. Even when literal interpretation remains uncertain. Because human beings instinctively respect messages that survive impossible spans of time. A warning whispered disappears. A warning carved into permanence demands attention. And yet the deeper question remains unresolved. If such a warning existed, what event could have inspired it? A flood? A collapse? A forbidden experiment? A political disaster mythologized into cosmic language? Or something far stranger? Because Mesopotamian civilization did not merely fear destruction. It preserved stories of worlds ending. Cities drowning. Kings failing. Orders collapsing. And some of those stories contain themes that sound disturbingly close to one idea humanity never stops fearing. that knowledge itself can destroy the civilization that creates it. And if that possibility shaped the warning, then we must ask a far more unsettling question. What ancient catastrophe made that lesson necessary? What ancient catastrophe made that lesson necessary? Because civilizations do not preserve warnings in durable clay without reason. A story can entertain. A myth can explain. A prayer can comfort. But a warning exists to prevent repetition. And if an ancient Mesopotamian civilization chose to preserve cautionary language in a medium designed to outlast generations, then whether the message was literal, symbolic, theological, or historical, one uncomfortable truth remains. Someone believed something dangerous had happened. Or could happen. That possibility takes us into one of the oldest fears in human civilization. Catastrophe. Not inconvenience. Not hardship. Catastrophe. The kind of event so overwhelming that it reshapes collective memory for centuries. And ancient Mesopotamia knew catastrophe intimately. This was a civilization built in one of the most fertile yet unstable environments on Earth. The rivers that sustained life could also destroy it. Floods could nourish farmland one year and erase entire settlements the next. Agricultural collapse could trigger famine. Political instability could destroy cities. Invading armies could reduce temples to rubble. To ancient Mesopotamians, civilization never felt invincible. It felt fragile, temporary, conditional. That mindset changes how we read their stories. Because people who live in stable systems imagine permanence. People who live near collapse imagine warning. And Mesopotamian literature reflects that psychology constantly. Again and again, we encounter themes of destruction, divine anger, fallen kings, broken order, and catastrophic consequence. Which means if a warning text existed, it would emerge from a civilization already deeply familiar with existential fear. But there is one catastrophic motif above all others that dominates ancient Mesopotamian memory. The flood. Few stories from the ancient world are as enduring, or as unsettling, as the flood narratives preserved in Mesopotamian tradition. Long before later Abrahamic traditions popularized global flood imagery, Mesopotamian cultures were already preserving stories of overwhelming destruction. Entire populations wiped away. Civilization reset. Humanity judged. Survivors carrying memory into the future. These were not minor legends. They were foundational. And that matters enormously. Because flood stories are, at their core, warning narratives. Civilization is fragile. Human behavior has consequences. The world can be reset. That emotional logic becomes deeply relevant to our mystery. Because once a culture preserves catastrophe stories for thousands of years, later warning language becomes psychologically understandable. Not proof, but context. Yet flood may not be the only fear embedded in Mesopotamian storytelling. Ancient texts also reveal another recurring anxiety. Human overreach. Crossing boundaries. Attempting access to knowledge or power not meant for ordinary mortals. This is one of humanity's oldest narrative patterns. The forbidden threshold. The dangerous secret. The wisdom that costs too much. The action that invites destruction. Civilizations across history tell these stories. Mesopotamia was no exception. And this is where our warning becomes more disturbing. Because catastrophe is frightening enough when caused by nature. But catastrophe caused by human action feels far closer to modern fears. Now imagine a civilization preserving a warning not about flood alone, but about behavior, knowledge, hubris, choices. That kind of warning does not expire. It evolves. Every generation reinterprets it according to its own anxieties. To ancient people, forbidden knowledge might mean divine secrets. To medieval readers, heresy. To modern viewers, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, nuclear weapons, surveillance, ecological collapse. The technology changes. The emotional structure remains identical. That is why ancient warnings feel so strangely contemporary. Because they speak to recurring human patterns. Then comes the unsettling question. What if the catastrophe that inspired such warnings was real? Not supernatural. Not mythological. Real. History offers countless examples. Civilizations collapse. Cities burn. Knowledge disappears. Archives vanish. Empires fall. Ancient people did not need science fiction to understand devastation. They lived with it. Which means a warning encoded in ancient clay could easily preserve memory of genuine civilizational trauma later mythologized over time. A flood becomes divine judgment. Political collapse becomes cosmic punishment. Technological loss becomes forbidden knowledge. Memory transforms through storytelling. This happens everywhere in human culture. Which makes the warning more intriguing, not less. Because now we no longer need impossible explanations. Only ordinary historical trauma amplified by centuries of retelling. But then comes the opposite possibility. What if the warning was intentionally exaggerated? That too would be historically familiar. Warnings are persuasive when dramatic. Ancient priests, kings, and scribes understood authority. A terrifying message controls behavior more effectively than a mild suggestion. Obey. Do not cross. Remember what happened. Civilizations use fear to preserve order. That interpretation also fits the evidence. And yet, there remains a stubborn emotional detail that keeps mystery alive. Some warnings feel larger than immediate politics. Larger than one king. Larger than one flood. Larger than one generation. They feel universal. That is why they survive. Because universality makes stories portable. A warning about one forgotten city dies with that city. A warning about human nature survives forever. This may be the true secret behind ancient enduring myths. Not hidden knowledge. Not literal prophecy. Human psychology. And yet the ancient world occasionally preserves stories so strange that psychology alone feels unsatisfying. Descriptions of divine beings transmitting knowledge. Warnings about boundaries between worlds. Consequences tied to access rather than simple morality. Suddenly the catastrophe becomes more ambiguous. Was the danger environmental, political, religious, or epistemological, the danger of knowing something humanity should not know? That last possibility is where modern fascination intensifies dramatically. Because forbidden knowledge is perhaps the most seductive story archetype ever created. Knowledge hidden. Knowledge suppressed. Knowledge dangerous enough to destroy civilizations. No wonder audiences cannot resist. And if even fragments of such a warning survive from more than 5,000 years ago, then the emotional power becomes almost irresistible. Because now we are not merely discussing ancient collapse. We are confronting an idea every age fears. That civilization destroys itself not because it is weak, but because it reaches too far. Still, one question remains. If catastrophe inspired the warning, who exactly witnessed it closely enough to record the message at all? Because this is the point where the mystery shifts from event to authorship, and authorship changes everything, since a warning means very little until we understand who believed the warning needed to be preserved, who held the authority to commit that message to durable clay, and what kind of mind imagined that the future might one day need to hear it. Ancient Mesopotamia was not a civilization where writing belonged to everyone. Writing was specialized, controlled, labor-intensive, and deeply connected to institutional power. To modern audiences, writing feels ordinary. A note can be typed in seconds, a warning posted instantly, a thought transmitted globally with almost no effort. But in the ancient world, writing was costly. It required training, materials, skill, and purpose. A clay tablet was not casual communication. A clay tablet represented intention. Someone had to prepare the clay, shape it, inscribe it, preserve it, and often archive it. That means every surviving written message reflects deliberate effort. This matters enormously. Because if a warning was preserved in clay, then someone with access to literacy, and likely institutional authority, considered the message important enough to survive beyond immediate conversation. That alone narrows the possibilities dramatically. Who wrote in ancient Mesopotamia? Primarily scribes. But scribe in the ancient world does not mean what many modern viewers imagine. A scribe was not merely someone who copied text mechanically. Scribes were among the intellectual class of their civilization. They handled administration, law, accounting, diplomacy, religious texts, royal records, and historical preservation. In many ways, they were the memory architecture of civilization itself. Kings ruled. Priests interpreted divine meaning. But scribes preserved reality. Or at least the version of reality powerful institutions wanted remembered. That detail introduces immediate complexity. Because if our mysterious warning originated in an institutional environment, then authorship might not reflect personal testimony at all. It could reflect political messaging, religious doctrine, cultural caution, mythic tradition, or deliberate social control. Ancient civilizations understood narrative power. This is not a modern invention. Stories shape obedience. Warnings shape behavior. Cosmic consequences reinforce hierarchy. A civilization concerned with maintaining order would absolutely preserve narratives designed to influence future conduct. And Mesopotamia was obsessed with order. But that is only one possibility. Because scribes did not invent content in isolation. They copied, transmitted, adapted, and preserved existing traditions, some of which may have originated long before the surviving tablets themselves. This is one of the most important realities in ancient textual study. The physical tablet may not be the original composition. It may be a copy of a copy. A later preservation of much older oral or written tradition. Which means the question, who wrote the warning, may not have a single answer. The hand that pressed symbols into surviving clay might not be the mind that first conceived the message. That distinction opens the mystery dramatically. Because now authorship becomes layered. A warning preserved by one generation may have originated from another. A later scribe may record ancient fear without personally believing it. Or may preserve institutional mythology because preservation itself was part of cultural continuity. This happens constantly in human history. Texts outlive belief systems. Stories survive original contexts. Messages persist after meaning evolves. So when modern viewers imagine a single dramatic ancient witness urgently carving a message into clay for future humanity, reality may be more complex. And yet, the emotional image remains powerful. A scribe in dim light. A reed stylus. Wet clay. Urgency. Deliberate marks. A warning preserved against time. Because even if literal authorship is layered, someone still chose preservation. Someone believed continuity mattered. That is historically significant. Now let us widen the question. If not a scribe acting independently, then under whose authority? Kings? Priests? Temple institutions? Royal archives? Each possibility changes interpretation. A royal warning implies political purpose. A priestly warning implies theological meaning. An archival preservation implies institutional memory. And Mesopotamian civilizations were deeply institutional. Temples were not merely places of worship. They were economic centers, political hubs, administrative engines, knowledge repositories. Religious authority and practical governance often overlapped extensively. That means messages preserved in such contexts may reflect collective worldview rather than individual testimony. Which brings us to priests. Priests are among the most intriguing candidates in any ancient warning narrative because priestly classes occupied the intersection of ritual, cosmology, interpretation, and institutional authority. They studied signs, tracked celestial events, interpreted omens, managed sacred knowledge, controlled access to ritual spaces, communicated between divine narrative and social order. If a warning involved cosmic consequence, forbidden boundaries, or civilizational danger, priestly involvement becomes highly plausible. But priestly authorship introduces another fascinating dimension: symbolism. Priests rarely communicated in modern literalistic language. Ancient religious communication was often layered, metaphorical, cosmological, and ritually encoded. A warning about behavior might appear as divine narrative. A political caution might appear as myth. Historical trauma might become sacred story. This is not deception in the modern sense. It is cultural communication. Ancient audiences understood symbolic frameworks differently than we do. Which means what sounds literal to some modern mystery interpreters may have been understood symbolically by original contexts. That caution is essential. And yet symbolism does not make the warning less powerful. Sometimes symbolic warnings are more durable precisely because they transcend specifics. A literal flood warning expires after the flood. A mythologized warning about human arrogance survives indefinitely. That durability may explain preservation better than any sensational interpretation. But let us not dismiss another possibility too quickly. Eyewitness memory. Could an ancient warning preserve memory of genuine observed catastrophe? Absolutely. Ancient texts often contain historical residues embedded in narrative frameworks. Disasters happen. Empires fall. Cities burn. Witnesses survive. Memories transform through retelling. Over generations, history and myth blend. The result is neither pure fiction nor straightforward documentation. It becomes cultural memory. That may be precisely what we are dealing with. A warning shaped by remembered trauma. Not necessarily literal in every detail, but rooted in real existential experience. This interpretation is psychologically powerful because it explains both urgency and mythic structure simultaneously. Real danger creates emotional force. Cultural retelling creates symbolic expansion. Clay preservation creates longevity. Everything fits. Then comes the most provocative interpretation of all. What if the warning originated from knowledge custodians? Not priests merely preserving theology. Not scribes merely recording administration. But individuals or institutions preserving restricted knowledge. This is where modern fascination accelerates rapidly. Because the concept of hidden knowledge is one of the most irresistible narrative engines in human culture. Forbidden archives. Restricted texts. Suppressed discoveries. Guarded truths. Audiences are magnetically drawn to these ideas. Ancient Mesopotamia, with its temple archives, specialized literacy, and institutional secrecy, provides fertile imaginative ground for such speculation. Did secret knowledge actually exist? Certainly in some form. All hierarchical societies restrict information. The question is scale and meaning. Restricted ritual procedures? Very likely. Controlled administrative records? Absolutely. Dangerous cosmic secrets about civilization-ending truths? That moves into speculation. But speculation thrives where ambiguity survives. And ambiguity is everywhere in ancient history. Which brings us back to the warning itself. If the warning was preserved deliberately, its author, or preserving institution, must have believed one thing with absolute clarity. Forgetting was dangerous. That belief alone is extraordinary. Because civilizations preserve what they value. Law. Religion. Kingship. Trade. Myth. If warning joins that list, then warning mattered structurally. Not incidentally. And that raises a final unsettling possibility. What if the warning survived not because the original catastrophe was unique, but because the underlying human behavior keeps repeating? That would explain everything. Preservation. Universality. Emotional resonance. Timeless relevance. The warning survives because the danger survives. Not one ancient event. A recurring pattern. Human overreach. Human arrogance. Human failure to respect limits. That interpretation transforms authorship from historical curiosity into something larger. The ancient writer, whoever he was, becomes less an individual witness and more a voice in a long civilizational conversation humanity keeps refusing to finish. Still, one question remains impossible to ignore. If the warning was preserved intentionally, what exactly did they fear future generations might repeat? That question sits at the heart of this entire mystery, because warnings only make sense when behavior remains possible, and if an ancient civilization chose to preserve cautionary language in durable clay rather than let it disappear with ordinary speech, then the danger they imagined must have felt larger than one ruler, one city, or one generation, because no civilization spends precious effort preserving messages for the distant future unless it believes the underlying threat can return. And perhaps that is the most unsettling possibility of all. Not that ancient people feared something unique, but that they feared something timeless. Because when we study the oldest surviving civilizations honestly, one pattern becomes impossible to ignore: humanity changes its tools far faster than it changes its instincts. Ancient Mesopotamians lived in a world of clay, bronze, temples, kings, floods, and celestial omens. We live in a world of satellites, algorithms, biotechnology, artificial intelligence, global finance, nuclear arsenals, and machine learning. The surface is completely different. And yet the emotional architecture underneath feels disturbingly familiar. Ambition, power, competition, fear, curiosity, control, the desire to know what lies beyond accepted limits, the belief that intelligence alone protects us from consequences, the temptation to assume this time will be different. If an ancient warning survived because of those patterns, then its relevance becomes deeply uncomfortable. Because now the warning is not about a forgotten civilization. It is about civilization itself. Let us consider the most obvious possibility first. Human arrogance. Ancient cultures were obsessed with this theme. Again and again, civilizations told stories about pride preceding collapse, about rulers forgetting their limits, about societies mistaking temporary strength for permanent immunity. This is not uniquely Mesopotamian. It is nearly universal. But Mesopotamian cultures understood fragility with unusual intimacy because their world could change brutally and quickly. Floods destroyed cities. Political alliances collapsed. Invading armies erased generations of work. Agricultural systems failed. Power was never secure. Which means arrogance would have looked especially dangerous. A warning against overconfidence would fit perfectly. And perhaps that alone explains everything. But what if the fear went beyond arrogance? What if it involved knowledge? This possibility transforms the warning from moral philosophy into something much more psychologically potent. Because human beings do not merely fear destruction. We fear destruction caused by our own intelligence. That fear is ancient. Long before artificial intelligence, nuclear physics, or synthetic biology, civilizations imagined dangerous knowledge crossing boundaries humans should not cross. Forbidden fire. Forbidden wisdom. Forbidden names. Forbidden rituals. Knowledge is both power and threat. This archetype is ancient because it speaks directly to a recurring human dilemma. Can intelligence outpace wisdom? That question may be more relevant now than ever. But it may have felt relevant then as well. Ancient Mesopotamians did not frame it in modern technological language. They framed it cosmologically, divinely, mythically. But the emotional structure remains recognizable. Knowledge that destabilizes order. Power acquired without maturity. Access obtained without permission. Consequences following transgression. If such themes shape the warning, then its survival becomes understandable. Because civilizations repeatedly rediscover the same dangerous imbalance. Capability expanding faster than judgment. Then there is the possibility of environmental fear. Ancient Mesopotamia depended on fragile ecological balance. River behavior mattered. Agricultural systems mattered. Climate variability mattered. Civilization itself rested on environmental stability. When that stability failed, catastrophe followed. A warning rooted in ecological memory would make perfect historical sense. Future generations repeating unsustainable behavior. Ignoring environmental signals. Assuming abundance is permanent. Again, painfully modern. And perhaps that is why ancient warning narratives continue to resonate. Because environmental collapse no longer feels like distant history. It feels contemporary. But let us go deeper. Because some fears are even more psychologically fundamental. The fear of civilizational amnesia. Forgetting. This possibility is rarely discussed, yet perhaps it is the most haunting of all. What if the ancient writers feared not merely catastrophe, but forgetting the causes of catastrophe? That would explain preservation beautifully. A warning preserved because memory itself is fragile. Civilizations collapse. Archives burn. Languages disappear. Meaning erodes. Lessons vanish. And then descendants repeat ancient mistakes because the memory infrastructure failed. That interpretation is devastatingly plausible. History offers endless examples. Empires rise believing themselves unprecedented. Leaders repeat old errors with new confidence. Societies assume past collapse belongs to other people. Civilizational forgetting may be one of humanity's most consistent behaviors. If the warning addressed that pattern, its emotional power becomes extraordinary. Not because it predicts one dramatic event, but because it identifies a permanent human weakness. Then comes political fear. Power concentration. Corruption. Elite arrogance. Manipulation. The misuse of sacred authority. Ancient civilizations understood political danger intimately. Kingship was never morally neutral. Power could preserve order, or destroy it. Warnings embedded in myth often function politically as much as spiritually. A civilization preserving caution about rulers, institutions, or power abuse would be historically unsurprising. And once again, modern parallels emerge immediately. Which may explain why ancient stories remain so compelling. Because they rarely feel completely ancient. Then comes the most provocative possibility. Civilizational self-destruction through technological or intellectual overreach. This is where modern imagination becomes especially aggressive, often projecting contemporary anxieties backward into ancient texts. Advanced lost civilizations. Forbidden ancient science. Suppressed technologies. Catastrophic experiments. These interpretations often exceed available evidence dramatically. But they thrive because the emotional logic is compelling. Humanity fears creating what it cannot control. That fear is universal. Even if ancient texts expressed it symbolically rather than technologically. The precise mechanism matters less than the emotional structure. We reached too far. We failed to understand consequences. We suffered. Warn the future. That story works in every era. And perhaps that is precisely why it survives. Because it is endlessly adaptable. Now let us consider another unsettling possibility. What if the warning was intentionally vague? This would be strategically brilliant. A specific warning expires. A broad warning survives. Do not repeat this exact event becomes obsolete when circumstances change. Do not repeat this pattern remains timeless. Ancient storytellers may have understood this intuitively. Or institutional traditions may have evolved toward universality over time. Either way, ambiguity enhances longevity. And longevity appears central to our mystery. Still, one detail keeps returning. The medium. Clay. Heavy. Durable. Deliberate. Messages preserved in clay were not accidental whispers. They were architectural memory. Civilizations literally embedding thought into physical permanence. That matters psychologically. Because it signals intention beyond immediate communication. A preserved warning says, "This matters after we are gone." That is a profound civilizational act. And perhaps the most disturbing part is this. The warning may not have been preserved because ancient people believed future humanity would become different. It may have been preserved because they believed future humanity would remain exactly the same. Still curious. Still ambitious. Still impatient. Still convinced intelligence guarantees safety. Still willing to cross boundaries first and understand consequences later. If that was the fear, then the warning becomes far less mysterious. And far more personal. Because now the ancient message is no longer addressed to abstract descendants. It is addressed to civilizations exactly like ours. But if that is true, one final question becomes unavoidable. Did we already repeat the mistake they were trying to warn us about? That is the question where ancient mystery stops feeling comfortably distant and begins pressing uncomfortably against the modern world, because as long as the warning belongs safely to a forgotten civilization buried beneath dust and broken stone, it remains fascinating but harmless. Yet the moment we ask whether the same underlying human behavior survived into our own age, the entire story changes from archaeology into self-examination. And perhaps that shift is exactly why ancient warnings continue to grip us so powerfully. Because deep down, most people do not fear ancient catastrophe itself. They fear repetition. They fear the possibility that civilizations separated by thousands of years may still make remarkably similar mistakes while convincing themselves they are fundamentally different. The technologies change. The language changes. The political systems change. The architecture changes. But human behavior often changes far more slowly. And that is where this mystery becomes psychologically unsettling. Because when we examine the patterns ancient civilizations repeatedly warned about, arrogance, overreach, fragile systems, misused knowledge, ignored warning signs, institutional blindness, overconfidence in power, we immediately recognize them. Not in abstract historical imagination. In ourselves. This does not prove the ancient warning predicted modern events. That would be a dramatic overstatement. But prediction is not required for relevance. Patterns are enough. Civilizations do not need identical technologies to repeat identical psychological errors. And perhaps that is the most important distinction in this entire investigation. Because people often hear ancient warning and imagine prophecy. Dates. Specific events. Cosmic forecasts. But history suggests something more nuanced. The most durable warnings survive not because they predict exact futures. They survive because they identify recurring human vulnerabilities. And recurring vulnerabilities are terrifying precisely because they remain recognizable. Let us begin with the most obvious modern parallel. Technological overreach. No previous civilization in human history has possessed the level of technical capability we currently wield. Artificial intelligence. Autonomous weapons. Biotechnology. Mass surveillance. Algorithmic behavioral manipulation. Planet-scale communication systems. Nuclear arsenals. Genetic editing. Machine learning systems whose creators themselves struggle to fully explain internal decision pathways. This is historically unprecedented power. And unprecedented power always produces the same dangerous illusion. That capability equals wisdom. Ancient civilizations could not imagine neural networks or quantum computation. But they absolutely understood the broader pattern. Acquiring power faster than acquiring restraint. That fear is timeless. And if an ancient warning encoded that structure symbolically, the relevance becomes almost disturbingly clear. Now consider environmental fragility. Mesopotamian civilizations lived in direct dependence on ecological balance. River behavior mattered existentially. Climate disruption could collapse food systems. Infrastructure failure could destabilize governance. Environmental unpredictability was civilizational risk. Sound familiar? Modern civilization, despite extraordinary technological sophistication, remains astonishingly vulnerable to ecological disruption. Supply chains. Agriculture. Energy systems. Water access. Infrastructure resilience. Complex societies often appear stronger than they truly are because complexity creates an illusion of control. Ancient collapse studies repeatedly show that resilience can vanish faster than civilizations expect. Again, this does not prove ancient prediction. It demonstrates recurring structural vulnerability. And recurring vulnerability is enough. Then comes institutional arrogance. This may be the most universal civilizational weakness of all. Powerful institutions routinely assume continuity. Empires imagine permanence. Economic systems imagine stability. Political leadership imagines adaptability. Technological elites imagine competence. History repeatedly humiliates such confidence. Mesopotamian rulers likely believed their cities represented durable order. Many did not survive. Rome imagined permanence. It fractured. Countless empires assumed exceptional immunity. History was unimpressed. Modern civilization often behaves similarly. Too advanced to fail. Too interconnected to collapse. Too informed to repeat primitive mistakes. Such confidence is emotionally familiar across eras, which makes ancient warnings feel uncomfortably relevant. But perhaps the most fascinating parallel involves information. Knowledge abundance without wisdom integration. This may be the defining modern dilemma. We possess unprecedented information access. Yet information alone does not produce judgment. In some cases, it amplifies confusion. Noise overwhelms clarity. Manipulation outpaces verification. False certainty spreads faster than disciplined reasoning. Knowledge becomes fragmented, accelerated, emotionally weaponized. This is a profoundly modern phenomenon in technological form. Yet psychologically, it resembles a much older fear. knowledge destabilizing order. Not because knowledge itself is evil, but because unmanaged knowledge changes power relationships. Ancient priesthoods controlled information precisely because information mattered. Modern systems distribute information differently, but control dynamics remain central. Again, the surface changes. The structure persists. Then there is the issue of warning fatigue. This is perhaps one of humanity's most consistent weaknesses. Civilizations are repeatedly warned. Environmental scientists warn. Historians warn. Engineers warn. Policy experts warn. Ethicists warn. Public health specialists warn. And yet warning does not automatically produce behavioral change. Humans are astonishingly capable of normalizing risk. Ancient civilizations likely behaved similarly. Repeated signals become background noise. Familiar danger becomes psychologically invisible. Warnings lose emotional force precisely when they are most necessary. If an ancient message sought to combat that pattern, its ambition was extraordinary. Because warning against warning fatigue is one of the hardest communication challenges in human history. Now let us confront another uncomfortable possibility. Civilizations often collapse not because no one recognized danger, but because recognition arrived too late. This distinction matters enormously. History is filled with systems where warning signs existed. Political instability, environmental stress, economic imbalance, social fragmentation, institutional rigidity, elite denial. But recognition failed to produce timely adaptation. That pattern feels profoundly modern and deeply ancient. Which brings us back to the emotional genius of timeless warning narratives. They do not require precise prediction. They require structural truth. Humans ignore risk until consequence arrives. That statement works in nearly every era. And perhaps that is why such warnings survive so effectively. Because they continue being correct. Still, we must resist one temptation. Projection. Modern audiences often project contemporary anxieties backward into ancient texts, interpreting vague symbolism as specific commentary on modern technologies or geopolitical realities. This is intellectually dangerous. Ancient writers were not secretly discussing artificial intelligence. Mesopotamian scribes were not forecasting digital surveillance states. Historical integrity matters. But psychological continuity matters too. The warning does not need modern specificity to remain meaningful. Human patterns are enough. Then comes the most haunting parallel of all. Civilizational complexity itself. Complex societies often become brittle. The more interconnected systems become, the more hidden dependencies emerge. Failures cascade. Small disruptions amplify. Institutions assume resilience until resilience fails. Ancient Mesopotamia was complex for its time. Trade networks, political hierarchies, agricultural dependencies, administrative systems. When complexity becomes fragile, collapse risk changes dramatically. Modern civilization operates complexity at unimaginable scale. That alone should inspire humility. And perhaps humility is exactly what ancient warning narratives were designed to preserve. Not technical instructions. Not prophecy. Humility. Recognition of limits. Recognition that civilization is not guaranteed. Recognition that intelligence does not eliminate vulnerability. Recognition that forgetting history creates dangerous confidence. If that is the lesson, then yes, we may already be repeating the mistake. Not because ancient Mesopotamian texts predicted modern machines, but because the underlying human behaviors remain alarmingly familiar. Still, one final mystery remains. If the warning survived for thousands of years, why does it still feel like it was written for us? If the warning survived for thousands of years, why does it still feel like it was written for us? That may be the most disturbing question in this entire investigation, because ancient history becomes easier to dismiss when it remains emotionally distant, when its symbols feel foreign, when its fears belong clearly to people whose world has nothing in common with ours. But the moment an ancient message begins sounding psychologically familiar, the distance collapses, and what once felt like archaeology begins to feel uncomfortably personal. Because perhaps the true mystery here was never the tablet itself, Not the clay. Not the damaged inscription. Not the buried archive. Not even the exact wording, however unsettling later interpretations may make it seem. Perhaps the real mystery is us. Why do modern human beings, living in an age of satellites, machine intelligence, planetary data systems, genomic editing, and technological capabilities ancient civilizations could not have imagined, still respond so intensely to the emotional architecture of a warning written more than 5,000 years ago? Why does it still work? Why does the ancient structure remain effective? Because if we answer that honestly, we may discover something more unsettling than any hidden tablet. That human psychology changes far less than human technology. The ancient world feared collapse. So do we. The ancient world feared hidden consequences. So do we. The ancient world feared crossing boundaries without understanding the cost. So do we. The ancient world feared that intelligence without wisdom could become dangerous. So do we. That continuity is extraordinary. And perhaps that continuity is the true reason ancient warning narratives survive. Not because they contain impossible secrets. Because they contain recognizable humans. Let us imagine the ancient scribe again. Not as a mystical prophet. Not as a cinematic guardian of forbidden truth. But as a human being living inside uncertainty. A civilization vulnerable to environmental disruption. Political instability. Social hierarchy. Institutional pressure. Religious fear. Limited information. Real danger. He may not have understood the future. He may not have imagined our world at all. But he understood something universal. Humans make dangerous assumptions. That insight alone is timeless. And perhaps that is enough. Because every civilization believes itself unusually advanced relative to what came before. This is nearly universal human behavior. The Romans believed themselves heirs of order. Industrial societies believed themselves masters of progress. Digital societies believed themselves intellectually superior to analog ones. Technological confidence creates emotional distance from historical humility. We know better. We are different. We would not repeat primitive mistakes. History hears this constantly. And history rarely rewards it. That is one reason ancient warnings remain emotionally powerful. They challenge civilizational exceptionalism. They remind us that collapse is not something that happens only to less sophisticated people. It happens to organized societies. Advanced societies. Confident societies. Resource-rich societies. Educated societies. That realization is psychologically destabilizing. Because it removes comforting assumptions. And perhaps that is exactly what good warnings are supposed to do. Disrupt false confidence. Now consider something even deeper. Humans are uniquely future-oriented creatures. We imagine outcomes. Anticipate consequences. Construct scenarios. Fear delayed danger. This cognitive capacity is one of our greatest strengths. It is also one of our greatest sources of anxiety. Warnings exploit that beautifully. A warning is essentially a structured future imagination. If this continues, if this happens, if you fail to change, ancient warnings leverage the same psychological machinery modern risk communication still depends on. That continuity matters. Because it explains why the emotional mechanics still function. The specific symbols may change. The underlying cognition remains constant. Then there is mortality. Perhaps the deepest continuity of all. Ancient civilizations feared disappearance. Modern civilizations do too, even if they express it differently. Ancient people feared flood, famine, invasion, divine anger, dynastic collapse. Modern people fear climate instability, systemic failure, technological catastrophe, nuclear escalation, institutional breakdown. Different vocabulary. Same existential structure. The human fear of non-continuity. The fear that what feels permanent may not be. Warnings thrive in that emotional terrain. Because warnings speak directly to vulnerability. And vulnerability remains one of the most universal human experiences. Still, something about ancient warnings feels especially powerful. Why? Scarcity. Ancient messages survived against impossible odds. Clay outlasting empires. Fragments surviving destruction. Languages requiring reconstruction. Meaning crossing thousands of years. Survival itself creates emotional authority. Even before content is evaluated. A message surviving 5,000 years automatically feels important. Humans instinctively attach significance to endurance. If something lasted that long, surely it mattered. This psychological bias is powerful. Sometimes useful. Sometimes misleading. But always emotionally effective. And mystery storytelling understands this instinct perfectly. Ancient survival equals perceived significance. Now let us confront a harder truth. Modern audiences are not merely attracted to ancient warnings because of historical curiosity. We are attracted because uncertainty exhausts us. Warnings simplify uncertainty. They create narrative shape. Danger. Cause. Consequence. Meaning. Humans crave meaningful structure, especially in unstable times. Ancient warnings provide exactly that. Even incomplete ones. Especially incomplete ones. Because incomplete warnings activate imagination. The missing pieces become psychological participation. We help finish the story. That participation creates emotional investment. Which may explain why damaged fragments often become more compelling than complete documents. Ambiguity creates engagement. Certainty ends conversation. Mystery prolongs it. That is why ancient unresolved warnings remain so culturally sticky. Still, there may be something even more personal happening. Projection. Modern viewers bring contemporary anxieties into ancient narratives. We see our fears reflected there. Artificial intelligence. Civilizational overreach. Environmental collapse. Institutional failure. Information chaos. Ancient texts become mirrors rather than windows. This does not necessarily invalidate the emotional experience. But it complicates interpretation. Because the warning may feel addressed to us partly because we are actively writing ourselves into it. That realization is intellectually important. And yet, projection itself tells us something meaningful. The fears we project reveal what matters now. Ancient warnings become diagnostic tools for contemporary anxiety. That may be more valuable than literal historical certainty. Because even if the original authors meant something entirely different, our reaction remains revealing. What do we fear enough to see ourselves in ancient catastrophe stories? That question may matter more than whether the tablet literally contained a specific warning. And perhaps that is where this investigation reaches its most unsettling conclusion. The tablet's greatest power may not lie in what ancient people meant. It may lie in what modern people hear. Because what we hear reveals us. If we hear technological overreach, perhaps we fear our inventions. If we hear environmental warning, perhaps we fear ecological fragility. If we hear institutional arrogance, perhaps we distrust our systems. If we hear forgotten history, perhaps we fear ignorance. Ancient warnings become emotional mirrors. And mirrors can be uncomfortable. Because they remove the illusion that danger belongs elsewhere. Still, one question remains after everything. Suppose the warning was symbolic. Suppose the dramatic interpretations are exaggerated. Suppose historians are correct to insist on caution. Suppose the literal mystery is far smaller than popular storytelling suggests. Even then, would the message lose its power? Not necessarily. Because symbolic warnings can be more durable than literal ones. Literal warnings expire with events. Symbolic warnings adapt. That may explain why ancient cautionary narratives survive so effectively. They remain interpretable, flexible, portable across eras. And perhaps portability was always their secret. Not precision. Universality. Which leaves us here. A modern civilization examining a damaged ancient message. Searching for meaning. Projecting fear. Seeking relevance. Wondering whether the past understood something we still struggle to articulate. And perhaps the strangest possibility of all is this. The ancient writers may not have intended to warn us specifically. But they understood human nature well enough that they did not need to. Because civilizations change. Humans less so. And if that is true, then the most disturbing part of this mystery is not that a warning survived. It is that it still makes sense. We cannot simply walk away from it. Not honestly. Because once an ancient warning begins sounding psychologically familiar, the natural instinct is to dismiss that familiarity as coincidence, narrative manipulation, or modern projection. And sometimes that is exactly what it is. Human beings are pattern-seeking creatures. We connect symbols across time. We impose meaning onto fragments. We turn uncertainty into story because uncertainty is emotionally uncomfortable. But even if all of that is true, the deeper question remains untouched. Why are the patterns so easy to recognize? Why does the emotional structure map so cleanly onto modern fears? Because perhaps repetition is not accidental. Perhaps repetition is what civilization does. Let us consider the broader historical record. Civilizations rarely collapse because they lack intelligence entirely. They collapse despite intelligence. This is one of history's cruelest lessons. Brilliant societies fail. Organized societies fail. Educated elites fail. Technologically impressive systems fail. Because collapse is rarely about stupidity alone. It is often about misaligned incentives, delayed adaptation, institutional rigidity, overconfidence, fragmented communication, and the inability to respond proportionally to emerging risk. Ancient Mesopotamians would not have described these processes in modern systems language. But they absolutely lived inside fragile complexity. Which means they understood instability emotionally, even if their explanatory frameworks differed. That matters. Because emotional understanding often survives where technical explanation evolves. A civilization does not need systems theory to recognize that arrogance precedes consequence. It does not need predictive modeling to recognize fragility. It does not need computational analytics to recognize repeated human failure. Ancient warning narratives may preserve emotional truths rather than technical ones. And emotional truths can remain disturbingly durable. Now imagine the perspective of future historians, if future historians exist. Imagine them examining fragments of our civilization. Broken data remnants. Ruined infrastructure. Corrupted archives. Partial cultural records. Disconnected technological artifacts. What would they conclude? Would they see rational governance? Measured restraint? Thoughtful long-term stewardship? Or would they see contradiction? Extraordinary technical sophistication paired with extraordinary behavioral inconsistency. A civilization capable of astonishing invention yet chronically divided about risk. A species able to model danger yet unable to coordinate response. That perspective is uncomfortable because it strips away self-flattering narratives. And perhaps ancient warnings function similarly. They remove the comforting illusion that intelligence guarantees maturity. This may be one of the most universal civilizational blind spots. We confuse capability with wisdom. Ancient rulers likely did. Modern institutions often do. The pattern persists because the emotional reward structure remains the same. Achievement feels like safety. Expansion feels like control. Complexity feels like resilience. Until reality disagrees. Then comes another uncomfortable question. Why do warnings so often fail? Because if humanity preserves cautionary narratives so effectively, why are dangerous patterns so persistent? Perhaps because warnings compete against stronger psychological forces. Immediate reward beats distant risk. Short-term gain beats long-term caution. Social conformity beats uncomfortable truth. Institutional incentives discourage disruptive adaptation. Humans do not merely need warnings. They need the capacity to act on warnings. That distinction is enormous. Ancient civilizations likely had warnings. So do we. The existence of warning is not the same as behavioral transformation. That may be the most sobering lesson of all. Because it means preserving knowledge is not enough. Understanding is not enough. Recognition is not enough. Civilizational survival may depend on translating warning into action. And that is historically rare. Which may explain why ancient cautionary stories feel tragic. Not because they contain mysterious secrets. Because they reveal recurring human limitations. Still, there is one final possibility worth confronting. What if the warning was never about catastrophe prevention at all? What if it served a completely different purpose? Social control. This interpretation deserves serious attention because ancient warning narratives often reinforced institutional authority. Warnings about divine punishment can encourage obedience. Warnings about forbidden knowledge can reinforce elite control over information. Warnings about boundaries can preserve hierarchy. Warnings about consequence can stabilize political order. This is historically plausible. Highly plausible. Ancient institutions understood narrative power. Fear can organize societies effectively. If the warning functioned partly as social control, that would not make it meaningless. It would make it historically normal. But even here, something fascinating happens. Narratives originally created for control can outlive their original purpose and acquire broader cultural meaning. A politically useful warning can become philosophical wisdom. A theological caution can become existential reflection. An institutional narrative can evolve into universal allegory. Stories are adaptive organisms. They survive by changing. That may be precisely what happened here. Which means the tablet's enduring power may have less to do with original intent and more to do with narrative evolution. The warning survived because it remained emotionally useful. Useful to ancient priests. Useful to later interpreters. Useful to modern mystery audiences. Useful because it speaks to uncertainty. And uncertainty never disappears. Now let us return to the image that began this investigation. A damaged clay fragment. Buried beneath ruins. Recovered centuries later. Meaning debated. Interpretation uncertain. And yet capable of generating extraordinary emotional force. That alone is remarkable. A civilization gone for millennia still influencing imagination. Still provoking self-reflection. Still raising questions. Not because certainty survived. Because ambiguity survived. And ambiguity is extraordinarily powerful. Because certainty tells us what to think. Ambiguity forces us to confront what we already think. That may be the true hidden warning inside the tablet. Not a literal message about specific catastrophe. A mirror. A test. A fragment that reveals the anxieties of whoever reads it. Ancient audiences may have seen divine consequence. Medieval audiences may have seen moral caution. Modern audiences see technological overreach, ecological fragility, institutional risk, hidden knowledge, and civilizational vulnerability. The tablet changes because we change. Or perhaps because we do not change enough. And that possibility is difficult to ignore. Because if civilizations repeatedly reinterpret the same warning through new symbols while preserving the same emotional structure, then perhaps the underlying danger is not historical circumstance. Perhaps it is human nature itself. And if human nature is the true repeating variable, then the warning may never stop being relevant. And perhaps that is the most unsettling conclusion of all. Not that an ancient civilization left behind a perfect prophecy. Not that a hidden tablet contains impossible secrets. Not that forgotten scribes somehow saw the modern world with supernatural clarity. But something far simpler. And far more disturbing. That human beings may be repeating the same patterns for thousands of years while convincing themselves each time that they are different. Because whether this buried Sumerian warning was literal history, symbolic mythology, institutional caution, or a fragment transformed by generations of interpretation, one fact remains impossible to ignore. More than 5,000 years ago, human beings were already asking questions that still haunt us today. What happens when knowledge outpaces wisdom? What happens when civilizations grow confident enough to ignore fragility? What happens when warning signs become background noise? What happens when humanity believes intelligence alone will save it? Those are not ancient questions. They are human questions. And perhaps that is why the story refuses to let go. The clay is ancient. The ruins are ancient. The language is ancient. But the fear feels modern. Disturbingly modern. Because maybe the warning was never meant to predict one single catastrophe. Maybe it was meant to preserve a pattern. A recurring human weakness. A civilizational blind spot. A truth every generation must rediscover for itself. That progress does not eliminate consequence. That power does not guarantee wisdom. That forgetting history is often the first step toward repeating it. The Sumerians are gone. Their temples fell. Their kings became dust. Their cities collapsed beneath time and sand. But their stories survived. And whether those stories preserved literal memory or symbolic caution, they still accomplished something extraordinary. They made strangers in another age stop and ask difficult questions. And maybe that is exactly what the warning was supposed to do. So now the question is yours. Do you believe ancient civilizations preserved real warnings from forgotten catastrophes? Or are we simply seeing our own fears reflected in broken clay? Tell me in the comments. And from which country are you watching tonight? If you enjoyed this journey into forbidden history, ancient mysteries, hidden warnings, and lost civilizations, subscribe to Ancient Code Chamber. Because history still has secrets buried beneath the dust. And some of them may be closer than we think. Until the next mystery. Keep questioning what history left behind.